I remember that morning with unsettling clarity. The day a beautifully wrapped box of chocolates showed up at my doorstep. The packaging looked expensive, the kind used by upscale confectioners, and resting on top was a handwritten note. For the greatest mother. With love, Thomas. Gestures like that from my son had become rare. Ever since he married Laura, something in him had shifted. She'd slipped into his life quietly at first, but her whispers carried sharp edges. She sowed little seeds of distance, making him believe I interfered too much, cared too loudly, loved too deeply. Slowly he drifted away, shorter calls, rushed visits, a coldness where warmth used to be. And yet I kept hoping. Hope is stubborn like that. So when the chocolates arrived, I let myself believe maybe things were changing. That my son remembered me. That the gap between us was closing. The chocolates glisten with gold foil, each piece shaped like a tiny piece of art. But I've never been one to indulge myself first. These are too beautiful to keep, I thought. The kids would love them. My grandchildren were my heart, even if their mother looked at me as though I were a nuisance. I placed the chocolates carefully in my bag and drove to their house. Laura opened the door wearing her usual tight smile. Polite on the surface, cold underneath. I handed her the chocolates, explaining that Thomas had sent them to me, but I wanted the children to enjoy them. For a moment, a strange look flickered in her eyes, something like confusion wrapped in worry. Then she covered it with her practiced smile as she took the box. She didn't invite me inside, she rarely did. Later that day, Thomas called. His voice carried a tension I wasn't used to. "Mom, did you like the chocolates?" he asked too intently. He never followed up on gifts. Usually once he gave something, that was the end of it. His tone unsettled me. I simply told him the truth. I hadn't eaten any and had given the box to his family. The silence that followed was thick. Then he erupted, yelling, demanding to know whether I was absolutely certain I hadn't tasted even one piece. He kept repeating the same questions, almost frantic, until finally he hung up, calling me foolish. I sat with the phone in my hand, shaken and confused. His panic lingered in my mind like a terrible omen. That evening Laura called. Her voice trembled, and for once, the tension she usually held toward me was gone. "The kids got sick," she said. "They ate the chocolates. They're at the hospital." My heart seemed to collapse inside my chest. I felt responsible, even though I had given the chocolates with love. She explained that something about the chocolates seemed off, an odd smell. But the children had already eaten several pieces by then. I barely slept that night. Every moment replayed in my mind. His panic. His anger. His insistence that I must not have eaten any. Slowly dread settled over me, whispering truths I didn't want to face. And then the realization struck, cold and undeniable. The chocolates weren't meant for my grandchildren. They were meant for me. Over the next days the nightmare deepened. Thankfully, the children began improving, but Laura told me the hospital found traces of poison. Something no one expects to hear in a normal family. She spoke to me without bitterness this time. "I don't think those chocolates were meant for us," she said softly. "I think they were meant for you." Thomas disappeared shortly after, no calls, no messages. He left his job without notice. He simply vanished. But I knew where he'd go. Whenever trouble appeared, he always ran to my younger sister, Natalie, who treated him as though he could do no wrong. I went straight to her house. She opened the door nervously, and there he was, sitting on her couch, pale and jittery. He tried to act normal, but when I confronted him, his facade crumbled. Laura arrived soon after, and everything spilled into the open. He admitted it, calmly, coldly. He had researched poisons, chosen gourmet chocolates to hide the taste, and calculated the dose so it would look like a natural medical crisis. He spoke about it with disturbing pride, as though it were some clever project. He even blamed me, saying my habit of giving things away had ruined everything, as though my generosity was an inconvenience. Laura was horrified. I was shattered. The boy I raised, the one I protected and loved endlessly, had become someone capable of taking my life. He sneered that I wouldn't report him because I had never once stood up to him. Not truly. For 40 years he had been right. But not anymore. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just stood up and told him we were done, that every bond between us had been cut. He hurled insults as I walked out, calling me weak, ungrateful, dramatic. His voice followed me down the steps, but I didn't look back. When I finally reached home, I broke down, not because of fear, but because I realized how long I had been blind. I cried for the decades of patience, forgiveness, and love poured into someone who never valued any of it. By the time the tears stopped, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woman who let herself be walked over was gone, and tomorrow I would become someone new. Someone stronger, someone who would never let him hurt me again. The next morning, I woke with swollen eyes, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in decades. I made myself a cup of tea, hands shaking slightly as I held the mug. Every corner of my home felt different now, familiar but no longer comforting, as if the walls themselves knew what I had learned. It was strange how quickly a lifetime could tilt. The son I would have died for had tried to ensure I never woke up again. I wasn't ready to report him yet. Not because of fear, that part of me had burned away, but because I needed to understand the full truth before taking the next step. I needed to know why. Why he became this monster. Why he chose me. Why he thought ending my life would somehow make his easier. I needed answers even if they tore me apart. I began sorting through old memories the way others sort through boxes in an attic. Slowly, carefully, each moment dusted with both love and regret. I thought of how Thomas had always been the child who wanted more. More attention, more praise, more leniency. I had given him too much, thinking indulgence was love. Perhaps it was my fault for feeding a hunger that only grew darker as he aged. But nothing justified what he had done. Nothing excused the plan he'd crafted with such precision. A soft knock at the door startled me. It was Laura. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and a heaviness I hadn't seen in her before. She stepped inside without speaking and placed a small plastic container on my table, the remains of the chocolate pieces she had kept for the doctors. Seeing them made my stomach twist. "I thought you should know," she said quietly. "The hospital confirmed the poison. They're involving the authorities. They just needed to speak with you as well." My heart pounded. I poured her a cup of tea, and for the first time since she married my son, we sat across from each other as two women who had both been deceived. Not rivals, not strangers, but mothers terrified for their children. She told me how Thomas had been distant for months, how money had been disappearing, how he had whispered to her in anger that I was holding him back. She admitted she ignored the warning signs, believing they were just stress or temporary moods. But now everything made sense to her, as if the pieces of a puzzle she'd been ignoring suddenly aligned. Her voice cracked. "I never thought he could hurt his own children. Or you. I'm so sorry." Hearing her apology brought me an unexpected comfort. The coldness she once held toward me softened into something real, something human. After she left, I sat in silence for a long time. The truth of what needed to be done settled in my bones. I could not save Thomas. I had tried for years. This was beyond anything a mother's love could repair. That afternoon I drove to the station. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but not from fear. This time it was resolve. The officer who spoke with me was kind, but I could see the disbelief in his eyes as he listened. It isn't every day that a mother walks in and calmly explains her son tried to poison her. I gave my statement. Every detail. Every memory. Every warning sign I had ignored. The officer asked if I still wanted to press charges. The question felt surreal, as though he was asking whether I wanted to step into a world where my son was no longer part of my life. But that world already existed. Thomas had left it the moment he made his choice. "Yes," I answered. "I want to proceed." Driving home afterward felt strange. I half expected to break down on the way, but the tears never came. Instead, there was a quiet strength growing inside me, something steady and unyielding. I had finally chosen myself. Later that evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Thomas. His voice sounded strained, brittle, like he hadn't slept in days. "Mom, you didn't actually go to the police, did you?" he asked, trying to sound calm but failing. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of the choice he made. "Mom, please," he continued. "You're overreacting. I didn't mean for anything bad to happen. You're making this bigger than it is." His words were a knife twisted with manipulation. The same pattern he had used all his life. Minimize, deny, twist. But I wasn't his puppet anymore. I told the truth, I said simply. Whatever happens now is because of what you did. He cursed under his breath, then hung up abruptly. For the first time, his anger didn't shake me. Clarified things. His desperation wasn't love. It was fear of consequences. I went to bed surprisingly calm that night. But somewhere deep down I knew this wasn't over. Thomas wasn't the kind of person to accept responsibility. He would lash out, twist, manipulate, he always had. And I was right. Early the next morning, a message arrived from my sister, Natalie. It was long, emotional, and laced with accusations. She claimed I was destroying Thomas's life, that I was exaggerating, that mothers are supposed to forgive. She begged me to stop the case, insisting he wasn't himself and didn't mean it. But every word she wrote only pushed me further away from the woman I used to be. Forgiveness without accountability isn't kindness. It's surrender. I closed her message without replying. For the first time in my life, I was choosing to save myself, not the son who had already tried to bury me. The days that followed were strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in right before a storm. I kept expecting someone to knock on my door, Thomas, Natalie, or even Laura. But the silence stretched on. I spent most of my time in the living room, staring out the window, waiting for something to happen yet dreading what that something might be. Then one afternoon there was a sudden heavy knock. I opened the door slowly, and standing there was an officer. He greeted me politely and explained they had located Thomas for questioning. He didn't tell me where they found him or what he said, only that the process had officially begun. When he left, I sat on the couch, numb. It all felt unreal. I couldn't fathom that the same child I once held in my arms, the boy who once cried for me in the night, was now being investigated for trying to harm me. But the harsh truth stayed with me. He wasn't that little boy anymore. He hadn't been for a very long time. A few hours later, my phone vibrated again. This time it was Laura. She sounded shaken. "He's furious," she said softly. "He's blaming everyone but himself." Of course he was. Thomas had always created his own world where he was never wrong, where he twisted reality until it suited whatever he wanted to believe. Hearing that he hadn't changed didn't surprise me. It only reminded me that involving the authorities had been the right thing to do. Laura told me she had taken the children to stay with her sister for safety. Her voice cracked when she said it. Part of her still loved him, I could hear it, but she also feared him now. That combination is a terrible weight for anyone to carry. Over the next week, I received a handful of messages from Natalie, each one more dramatic than the last. Pleas, guilt trips, accusations. She insisted I was tearing the family apart, that Thomas had simply made a mistake, that he was stressed, that mothers are supposed to protect their sons. But the version of me who used to fold under guilt was gone. I finally understood that shielding him from consequences wasn't love. It was enabling. And it had led us exactly to this moment. One evening, after several days of silence from everyone else, my doorbell rang again. This time it was a woman I didn't know, calm, professional, carrying a folder tucked under her arm. She introduced herself as an advocate assigned to assist me through the process. I invited her in, and she explained everything with a kindness I hadn't expected. She told me I had rights, something I had never truly considered. I had the right to protection, the right to be heard, the right to stand up for myself after decades of being dismissed. She explained how the case would move forward, what evidence would be examined, and what steps would follow. For the first time, I felt like the law saw me as someone worth protecting. It was a strange, almost foreign feeling. Later that night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. My reflection looked older than I remembered, lines deeper, eyes tired, but there was something new carved into my expression. Strength, stability, a quiet sort of courage I didn't know I had. But the calm didn't last long. A few days later, a letter appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't official, it was from Thomas. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure whether it would be a threat or another denial. Instead, it was filled with a mix of desperation and manipulation. He begged me to drop everything, to just let it go, claiming he hadn't meant for anything this serious to happen. He wrote about how I'd ruined his career, how I had embarrassed him, how everything now was somehow my fault. Not once did he say he regretted what he did. Not once did he apologize. Not once did he acknowledge the children. It was all about him, as it always had been. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not to keep it as some twisted memento, but because something told me I might need it. That evening Laura called again. She sounded steadier, stronger than before. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know you're doing the right thing." Her support meant more than I could express. The woman who once couldn't stand me was now the only person reaching out with genuine sincerity. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my living room. My entire life had shifted in just a matter of days. The weight of betrayal still sat heavily on my chest, but there was something else there now: resolve. I knew that this wasn't just about punishing Thomas. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had lost while loving him blindly. It was about choosing to live, truly live, without fear of what he might do next. Before going to bed, I whispered something aloud, not for anyone else but for myself. This time, I will not bend. Not for him. Not for anyone. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed it. The hearing date approached faster than I expected. Each evening, I found myself pacing the house, rehearsing what I would say even though no one had asked me to speak yet. I wasn't afraid of the courtroom itself. I was afraid of seeing him there. The boy I raised, the man he became, and the chasm between those two truths. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was gray, the kind of muted, heavy gray that feels like the world is holding its breath. I dressed carefully, choosing something simple and neat. My hands trembled only once, when I pinned on a brooch Thomas had given me years ago for Mother's Day. I removed it immediately. There was no sense in clinging to symbols from a past he had already destroyed. When I arrived at the courthouse, Laura was already waiting. She gave me a tentative smile, the kind people offer when they're trying to bridge a broken place. We walked inside together in silence. Even though so much had happened between us, standing beside her felt strangely steady, like two people holding the same truth, even if it had taken years to reach it. Inside the courtroom, Thomas sat across the room with his lawyer. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Laura either. His gaze stayed fixed on the table in front of him, jaw clenched, shoulders pulled tight. For a moment I searched his face for the child I once knew. But all I saw was a stranger wearing my son's features. The judge entered and the hearing began. Evidence was presented calmly, professionally. They discussed the chocolates, the medical reports, the statements. They went through everything piece by painfully deliberate piece. Hearing it all out loud, clinical, factual, felt surreal. Something so awful reduced to lines in a report. When they asked me to speak, my knees nearly buckled. But I stood anyway. My voice trembled at first, then steadied as I continued. I explained what happened as plainly as I could. No dramatics, no embellishments, just the truth. The judge listened intently, occasionally taking notes. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the table the entire time. Then it was his turn. His lawyer tried to paint him as overwhelmed, confused, under pressure. They claimed he hadn't intended anything fatal, that he merely made a terrible judgment call. They argued that stress had pushed him to the edge, and that he deserved compassion. But Thomas couldn't maintain the calm facade. Halfway through the hearing he snapped. He raised his voice, insisting this was all exaggerated, that he didn't mean to hurt anyone, that I had misunderstood. The anger bubbling beneath the surface seeped out, bit by bit, until even his lawyer placed a hand on his arm to quiet him. It was then that the judge finally looked directly at him. Her expression wasn't angry, it was disappointed, the way someone looks at a person who has squandered every opportunity to do the right thing. After closing statements, the judge announced that her decision would come later in writing. The room emptied slowly, everyone moving with a kind of solemn heaviness. I stayed seated for a moment to catch my breath. Laura waited beside me, not rushing me. When I finally stood, I felt lighter, not because things were resolved, but because I had faced him and survived it. I had spoken my truth, and he could no longer twist it. As we stepped outside into the cold air, Laura touched my arm gently. "You were brave in there," she said. "Stronger than I ever expected. He never thought you would stand up to him." I gave a small, tired smile. Neither did I. We parted ways and I drove home in silence, letting the emotions settle. I expected to collapse into tears, but instead, a calmness settled over me. Maybe it was the relief of finally being heard. Maybe it was the realization that the worst was behind me. Over the next few days, I tried to return to some kind of routine. I cooked simple meals. I walked around the neighborhood. I cleaned small corners of the house I had ignored for months. Ordinary tasks suddenly felt sacred, like reminders that I was still here, alive, breathing, reclaiming pieces of myself. Then one afternoon the letter arrived. I recognized the official seal immediately. My hand shook as I opened it, not from fear but from anticipation. I read the decision slowly, absorbing each sentence. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about acknowledging what had happened and protecting me from what could have happened. When I finished reading, I exhaled deeply. The weight I had been carrying for weeks lifted just enough for me to feel the ground beneath my feet again. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights flicker. I thought about everything that had happened, from the moment I received those chocolates to this quiet evening of relief. I wasn't the same woman I had been. I wasn't the mother who forgave everything simply because love demanded it. I had finally drawn a line, and crossing that line had saved my life. The morning after the letter arrived, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The light coming through the curtain seemed gentler somehow, as if the world itself understood something had shifted. I made breakfast slowly, savoring the simple routine that once felt meaningless. Each movement felt like a step forward, one I had earned. A few days later, Laura called again. Her voice carried a calmness I had never heard from her before. She told me she was moving out for good, taking the children somewhere safe. She didn't sound angry or panicked, just resolved. I can't keep living in fear, she said. And I won't let the kids grow up thinking this is normal. I felt something warm stir in my chest, a feeling I hadn't expected, pride. Not in myself but in her. She had finally found the strength to break away from a man who had manipulated all of us for far too long. We spoke longer than we ever had before, sharing more in that single conversation than we had in years of strained encounters. When she thanked me for standing up, for myself and for them, I almost didn't know how to respond. I had spent so much of my life holding my tongue, trying not to upset anyone, trying to keep peace even when the cost was my own well-being. To be thanked for doing the opposite felt foreign. After the call, I walked through my house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the corners of shelves. The space felt different now, quiet, but in a comforting way. It was no longer haunted by fear or memories of being dismissed. Felt like mine again. But healing is never a straight path. There were moments when guilt tried to creep back in. Moments when I remembered Thomas as a little boy, running to me with scraped knees or beaming with pride at a school award. Those memories still hurt, like tiny splinters lodged deep in my heart. But I reminded myself gently that remembering who he used to be didn't erase what he had become. One evening, while I was sorting through old papers, I came across an old photograph of us, me holding him in my arms, his tiny fingers clutching at my blouse. I held the picture for a long time, letting the pain wash over me but not drown me. Eventually, I placed it back into the drawer. Not out of anger but acceptance. The past was the past. It had shaped me, but it no longer controlled me. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. I attended a few community gatherings, something I hadn't dared do in a while. People greeted me kindly, and for the first time, I allowed myself to enjoy the conversations instead of shrinking into the background. I took long walks. I bought fresh flowers for the kitchen table. Small things but meaningful ones. One afternoon, I decided to visit the garden behind the house. It had grown a little wild, as if reflecting the chaos of the past months. I spent hours trimming plants, pulling weeds, and sweeping leaves. With every cut, every cleared space, I felt myself reclaiming a part of my life I had abandoned. When I stepped back and looked at the tidy garden, a quiet pride settled in my chest. It wasn't perfect, neither was I, but it was growing again. So was I. Weeks later, I received one final letter from the court. Everything was finalized. Protective measures were in place. The matter was no longer hanging in limbo. I felt relief, not triumph. This wasn't a victory, it was closure. That evening, I made myself a warm dinner and sat at the dining table alone. But for the first time in a long time, the solitude didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful, secure, my own. As I finished my meal, I realized something important. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies. Not for explanations. Not for him to change. The chapter was closed. Before going to bed, I stood by the window looking out at the quiet street. The world outside was calm, and for once the world inside me matched it. I whispered a few words softly, not out of anger or bitterness but out of release. I survived this, and I am free. Then I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and let myself sleep deeply, without fear, without doubt, without the weight of a son who no longer held a place in my life. This time the darkness was peaceful, and the dawn waiting for me would be mine alone. Life, that was everything. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts on this story in the comments. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.